You think you've seen everything the Old West has to offer. You think you know what it means to be tough, to survive against impossible odds, to stare death in the face and walk away laughing? Let me tell you about Clayton, One-Eyed Dalton, a man who took a bullet straight through his left eye socket during a bank robbery gone wrong, a bullet that should have scrambled his brains and left him dead in the street, but instead he survived, spent 6 months healing in a cave in the desert, and then rode back into the same town to finish what he started and get his revenge on the men who left him for dead. This isn't some campfire tale that got exaggerated over the years, this is documented history, recorded in court transcripts and newspaper accounts and the sworn testimony of witnesses who saw it happen with their own eyes. By the time I'm done telling you this story, you'll understand why the name Clayton Dalton struck fear into the hearts of lawmen and outlaws alike across 3 territories, and why his legend lives on as one of the most brutal, unbelievable survival stories in frontier history. So before we dive into this blood-soaked tale of betrayal, survival, and cold-blooded revenge, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this don't get told enough, and if you love tales of outlaws who refuse to stay dead and revenge that was served colder than a Wyoming winter, you're about to hear the best one ever told. Smash that like button if you're ready to have your mind blown, drop a comment if you think you could survive what Clayton Dalton survived, and let's ride back to 1889, to a dusty Arizona town called Copper Springs, where one of the most violent days in Western history was about to unfold. The summer of 1889 was brutal across the Arizona territory, the kind of heat that killed cattle and drove men mad, temperatures climbing past 110 degrees in the shade, and there wasn't much shade to be found in Copper Springs. The town sat in a valley between red rock mesas, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts that shimmered in the heat like a mirage, and its only claim to importance was the copper mine that gave it its name and the small bank that held the miners' payroll every 2 weeks. That bank, the Copper Springs Savings and Loan, was a modest building with thick adobe walls and iron bars on the windows, run by a careful man named Herbert Wilkins who prided himself on never having been robbed in the 15 years since the bank opened. That record was about to end in the most violent way possible, and Herbert Wilkins was about to learn that some men don't respect iron bars or careful planning or anything else except the barrel of a gun. Clayton Dalton was 28 years old in the summer of 1889, already a veteran outlaw with a reputation for being smart, ruthless, and absolutely fearless. He stood about 6 feet tall, built lean and hard like most men who lived on horseback, with dark hair that hung past his collar, a thick mustache, and eyes that people said were the coldest damn things they'd ever seen, like looking into a frozen lake and seeing nothing but your own death staring back at you. Clayton had been riding the outlaw trail since he was 16, when he killed his stepfather for beating his mother one time too many, and in the 12 years since, he had robbed stages, trains, and banks across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, always staying one step ahead of the law, always careful, always planning everything down to the last detail. He rode with a gang of 6 men, all of them experienced outlaws, all of them loyal to Clayton because he had a talent for picking targets that paid well and didn't get them killed, which was more than most gang leaders could claim. The 6 men who rode with Clayton Dalton were a rough crew, the kind of men who would cut your throat for a silver dollar and not lose a minute of sleep over it. There was Frank Hollister, Clayton's second-in-command, a big brutal man from Texas who had killed his first man at 14 and hadn't stopped since. There was Miguel Santos, a Mexican gunfighter who was wanted in 3 countries and could draw faster than anyone Clayton had ever seen. There was the Kerrigan brothers, Danny and Patrick, Irish immigrants who had come to America looking for opportunity and found it in robbery and murder. There was Sam Tucker, an ex-Confederate soldier who couldn't adjust to peace and found purpose in violence. And there was Wade Hutchins, the youngest of the group at 22, but already meaner than most men twice his age. These 6 men followed Clayton Dalton because he made them rich and kept them alive, and in the outlaw world, that was all the loyalty you could ask for. Clayton had been planning the Copper Springs bank robbery for 3 months, ever since he learned that the mine paid its workers on the 1st and 15th of every month, and that the bank held anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 in cash on those days, waiting for the miners to come collect their wages. $15,000 split 7 ways was more than $2,000 each, enough to live comfortably for a year if you were careful, enough to disappear into Mexico or California and start over if you wanted to. Clayton had scouted the town personally, had watched the bank's routines, had counted the number of deputies the sheriff had timed how long it took for people to react to trouble. He had planned everything perfectly, the way he always did, and on the morning of August 14, 1889, Clayton Dalton and his gang rode into Copper Springs convinced that in 30 minutes they would be riding out rich men. The first sign that something was wrong came when they split up to take their positions around town. The plan was simple: Clayton, Frank, and Miguel would go into the bank while the Kerrigan brothers, Sam, and Wade stayed outside to control the street and cover their escape. But as they were getting into position, Wade noticed something that made his stomach drop. There were too many men on the street, too many hard-looking characters lounging in doorways and on porches, and they all had that look that lawmen get when they're trying to pretend they're not lawmen. Wade rode up to Clayton and whispered urgently, "Boss, something's wrong, there's too many suspicious characters around, I think we've been set up." But Clayton looked at the bank, looked at the money that was inside, and made a decision that would change his life forever. "We're doing this," he said flatly. "We've come too far to turn back now, and maybe you're just seeing things. Stay sharp, and if there's trouble, shoot your way out." What Clayton didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Pinkerton Detective Agency had been tracking them for 6 months, following their pattern of robberies, predicting where they might strike next, and when the Pinkertons heard rumors that the Dalton gang was scouting Copper Springs, they set a trap. They brought in 20 armed men, a combination of Pinkerton agents and deputized civilians, and positioned them around the bank, waiting for the gang to make their move. The sheriff of Copper Springs, a man named Tom Bradshaw, had argued against the plan, said it was going to turn his town into a shooting gallery and get innocent people killed, but the Pinkertons had authority from the territorial governor and Bradshaw had no choice but to go along with it. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, Clayton Dalton pushed open the door to the Copper Springs Savings and Loan and walked inside, followed by Frank Hollister and Miguel Santos. There were 3 customers in the bank and 2 tellers behind the counter, plus Herbert Wilkins in his office, and they all looked up when the 3 men entered. Clayton pulled his pistol, a Colt .45 with a 7-inch barrel that he had carried for years, and pointed it at the ceiling. "This is a robbery," he announced in a calm, clear voice. "Everyone stay calm, do what you're told, and nobody gets hurt. We'll be out of here in 5 minutes and you can all go back to your boring lives." One of the customers, an older woman, started to scream, and Frank Hollister backhanded her across the face, not hard enough to seriously hurt her but hard enough to shut her up. The man said stay calm, Frank growled. The tellers started loading money into canvas bags that Miguel had brought, moving quickly with shaking hands, and for a moment it looked like the robbery was going to go smoothly, like Clayton's planning had paid off once again. But then Herbert Wilkins did something incredibly stupid or incredibly brave depending on how you looked at it. He pulled a small pistol from his desk drawer and fired at Clayton from his office. The shot was hurried and panicked and went wide, smashing a clock on the wall instead of hitting any of the outlaws, but it accomplished one thing: it signaled to the Pinkertons outside that the robbery was in progress, and all hell broke loose. The street outside exploded with gunfire as the 20 Pinkerton agents and deputies opened fire on the 4 outlaws who were supposed to be covering the escape. Wade Hutchins went down immediately, hit 3 times in the chest, dead before he hit the ground. Sam Tucker took a bullet in the leg and another in the shoulder but managed to dive behind a water trough and return fire. The Kerrigan brothers, Danny and Patrick, were caught in a crossfire on their horses and both went down, their animals screaming and thrashing as bullets tore through flesh and bone. Inside the bank, Clayton, Frank, and Miguel could hear the shooting and knew instantly that the plan had fallen apart, that they were trapped, that this was either going to end with them dead or in prison. "Back door!" Clayton shouted, and the 3 men ran toward the rear of the bank, leaving the bags of money behind, focused now on just surviving the next few minutes. But as they burst through the back door into an alley, they found themselves facing 4 Pinkerton agents with rifles already aimed at them. Miguel Santos, the fastest draw Clayton had ever seen, managed to shoot one of the agents before a rifle bullet caught him in the throat and sent him spinning to the ground, blood spraying in an arc that painted the adobe wall behind him. Frank Hollister fired twice, hitting another agent in the stomach, before taking a round in his upper arm that shattered the bone and sent his pistol flying from his hand. Clayton Dalton found himself facing the remaining two agents, both of them with their rifles trained on his chest, and he knew he had a split second to make a decision. He could surrender, spend the rest of his life in Yuma Territorial Prison, or he could go out fighting and die in this alley with his boots on. Clayton chose to fight. He raised his Colt and fired at the agent on the left, his bullet taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around, and then he pivoted toward the agent on the right. But that agent, a Pinkerton named James McAllister who had 15 years of experience and steady nerves, didn't panic. He aimed carefully, tracking Clayton's movement, and squeezed the trigger of his Winchester rifle just as Clayton was bringing his pistol to bear. The bullet hit Clayton Dalton just below and slightly to the left of his left eye, traveling at an angle through the eye socket, somehow missing the brain pan by a fraction of an inch, and exiting out the back of his skull above and behind his left ear. The impact snapped Clayton's head back violently and he went down like a puppet with its strings cut, his pistol clattering away across the alley stones, blood pouring from the catastrophic head wound. James McAllister looked down at Clayton's body, saw the amount of blood and the nature of the wound, and said to his partner, "This one's done, let's secure the others." They moved past Clayton's body, leaving him lying in a spreading pool of his own blood, assuming he would be dead in seconds if he wasn't already. But Clayton Dalton wasn't dead, though by every reasonable measure he should have been. The bullet had destroyed his left eye, had cracked his cheekbone and part of his skull, had created a wound that would have killed most men from shock and blood loss alone, but something in Clayton's physiology, some quirk of anatomy or just blind luck, meant that the bullet had tracked through his head without hitting anything immediately fatal. He lay there in that alley, bleeding out, his consciousness flickering like a candle in the wind, and he could hear the Pinkertons moving around, could hear them talking about how the gang was finished, how they had killed 4 and captured 3, could hear them discussing who would get credit for ending the notorious Dalton gang. And in that moment, lying in his own blood with his face destroyed and his vision gone on one side, Clayton Dalton made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided that he wasn't going to die in this alley, that he was going to survive this wound no matter what it took, and that he was going to come back and kill every single person who had set this trap. But first he had to survive the next few hours, which was far from certain. Clayton lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing, playing dead while the Pinkertons finished securing the area. He could feel his blood pumping out of the wound with each heartbeat, could feel himself getting weaker and colder, could feel death creeping closer with every second. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything he had ever experienced. His entire head felt like it was on fire and someone was driving nails through his skull, but Clayton used that pain, focused on it, let it keep him conscious and alert. He heard the Pinkertons eventually leave the alley, heard them taking Frank Hollister prisoner because he had survived his wound, heard them loading the bodies of Miguel, Wade, and the Kerrigan brothers into a wagon to take to the undertaker. Clayton waited until he was sure they were gone, until the sounds of activity had moved away toward the front of the bank, and then he forced himself to move. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than any robbery or gunfight, harder than anything he could have imagined. His body screamed at him to stay still, to let go, to slip into the darkness that was calling to him, but Clayton Dalton had never quit anything in his life and he wasn't about to start now. He rolled onto his side, pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, and started crawling deeper into the alley, away from the bank, away from the Pinkertons, away from the death that was waiting for him if he stayed. He crawled for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, dragging himself through the dirt and trash of the alley, leaving a trail of blood behind him that looked like someone had slaughtered a pig. His left eye was gone, just a ruined socket full of blood and destroyed tissue, and his vision on that side was nothing but darkness and pain, but his right eye still worked, and he used it to navigate, to find his way through back alleys and between buildings, putting distance between himself and the bank. He could hear shouting behind him, could hear people discovering the blood trail, could hear someone yelling that one of the outlaws was still alive and getting away, but Clayton kept moving because stopping meant dying or capture, and both of those were unacceptable. He found a horse, some miner's old nag tied behind a building, and Clayton pulled himself up into the saddle using every ounce of strength he had left. The horse, sensing something wrong with this bloody rider, tried to shy away, but Clayton got the reins and kicked the animal into motion, riding out of Copper Springs at a walk because he didn't have the strength to manage anything faster. People saw him leaving, saw the blood-covered man with half his face destroyed riding slowly down the back streets, but they were too shocked or too scared to try to stop him, and by the time anyone thought to organize a pursuit, Clayton had disappeared into the desert scrubland that surrounded the town. He rode for 5 miles, following instinct more than conscious thought, and then he fell off the horse and lay in the dirt under the brutal Arizona sun, his body finally giving out. He should have died there, should have bled out or died from infection or simply from the catastrophic trauma of having a bullet tear through his head, but Clayton's luck held one more time. A Mexican family traveling north from Sonora found him lying in the dirt that evening, and the father, a man named Esteban Rodriguez, looked at this bloody gringo outlaw and made a decision that would save Clayton's life. Instead of leaving him to die or turning him in to the authorities, Esteban loaded Clayton into his wagon, covered him with blankets, and took him to a place where the law wouldn't find him. That place was a cave system in the Superstition Mountains, a series of interconnected caverns that had been used by Apache warriors as a hideout for generations, and Esteban knew about it because his grandfather had been half Apache and had told him stories about the sacred caves where warriors went to heal from wounds. Esteban carried Clayton into the cave, laid him on blankets, and then rode back to Copper Springs to buy medical supplies, knowing he was taking a huge risk but feeling compelled by some sense of obligation or mercy or maybe just the belief that every man deserved a chance at survival. He bought bandages and carbolic acid and laudanum and everything else he could think of, told the store clerk he was treating an injured mule, and rode back to the cave system. For the next 6 months, Esteban Rodriguez and his wife Maria nursed Clayton Dalton back from the edge of death. They cleaned the wound every day with carbolic acid to prevent infection, changed his bandages, forced him to drink water and eat food even when he was delirious with fever, and slowly, impossibly, Clayton started to recover. The wound was horrific, his left eye was gone forever and the socket was a mass of scar tissue, the left side of his face was partially paralyzed from nerve damage, and he had persistent headaches that felt like his skull was splitting open, but he was alive, and by October of 1889, he was able to walk around the cave without assistance, able to feed himself, able to think clearly for the first time since the shooting. Clayton asked Esteban why he had saved him, why he had risked his own family's safety to help an outlaw, and the old Mexican just shrugged and said, "Because you were dying and I could help." Is it more complicated than that? Clayton didn't have an answer to that question, but he knew he owed this man and his family a debt that could never be repaid, so he promised Esteban that if he survived, if he ever got back on his feet, he would make sure the Rodriguez family was taken care of, would send them money, would protect them if they ever needed it. Esteban nodded and said that was good enough for him, and the two men never spoke of it again. By December of 1889, Clayton was strong enough to leave the cave, strong enough to ride, and strong enough to start planning his revenge. He had spent 6 months lying in that cave thinking about the trap that had been set for him, thinking about the Pinkertons who had shot him, thinking about Frank Hollister who had been captured and was probably in prison, thinking about all the ways he could make the people responsible pay for what they had done. The old Clayton Dalton had been a professional outlaw, a man who robbed banks for money and didn't take things personally, but the new Clayton Dalton, the one-eyed man who had crawled through hell and survived, was something different, something darker and more dangerous. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a burning desire for revenge that consumed every waking thought. Esteban tried to talk him out of it, told him that revenge was a fool's errand, that it would just get him killed or captured, that he should take this second chance at life and disappear into Mexico, change his name, start over. But Clayton just smiled, his ruined face twisting into something that was more grimace than smile, and said, "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Esteban, more than you'll ever know, but I can't let this go. Those men tried to kill me, left me for dead, and I'm going to show them what a mistake that was. I'm going to go back to Copper Springs, and I'm going to finish what I started." Esteban shook his head sadly, knowing there was nothing he could say to change Clayton's mind, and he gave the outlaw one of his horses, a strong bay gelding, and enough supplies to reach Arizona. Clayton rode south from the Superstition Mountains in early January of 1890, 5 months after the failed robbery, and he looked like a completely different man from the one who had ridden into Copper Springs that August morning. He was thinner, harder, his face partially covered by the black eye patch he now wore over his ruined left eye, his hair longer and streaked with gray that hadn't been there before. His entire demeanor changed from confident outlaw to something more like a ghost seeking vengeance. He rode slowly and carefully, avoiding main roads and towns, living off the land and staying out of sight, because he knew that every lawman in the territory would still be looking for any survivors of the Dalton gang. He learned from conversations overheard in mining camps and from old newspapers he found that Frank Hollister had been tried, convicted, and sent to Yuma Territorial Prison for 20 years, that the Pinkerton Detective Agency had claimed credit for breaking up the Dalton gang, and that James McAllister, the agent who had shot Clayton, had been promoted and was now running the Pinkerton office in Tucson. Clayton also learned something that made his blood boil. Herbert Wilkins, the bank manager who had fired the first shot, was being hailed as a hero, had been given a reward by the bank's owners, and was running for mayor of Copper Springs on a platform of standing up to outlaws. That information settled one question in Clayton's mind. He would go back to Copper Springs, he would rob that bank again, and he would make Herbert Wilkins pay personally for what he had started. But Clayton wasn't stupid, wasn't going to just ride into town guns blazing and hope for the best. He had learned his lesson about careful planning versus overconfidence, and he spent 2 months scouting Copper Springs from a distance, watching the routines, counting the deputies, observing how the town had changed since the shootout. What he found was that Copper Springs had gotten more careful, more paranoid. The sheriff's office now had twice as many deputies, the bank had hired armed guards, and there was a general atmosphere of vigilance that hadn't been there before. Everyone in Copper Springs remembered the Dalton gang shootout, remembered the blood and the bodies, and they were determined it would never happen again. Clayton realized that a frontal assault was out of the question, that he couldn't rob the bank the way he had tried before, so he came up with a different plan, one that relied on surprise and terror rather than force. He would wait until after dark, when the town was asleep, and he would break into Herbert Wilkins' house. He would force Wilkins to go to the bank and open the safe, and then he would take the money and disappear before anyone knew what happened. It wasn't as clean as his original plan, it was messier and more personal, but Clayton didn't care about clean anymore. He cared about revenge, and he cared about making Wilkins suffer the way Clayton had suffered in that alley with a bullet through his head. On the night of March 23, 1890, 7 months after the shootout, Clayton Dalton rode into Copper Springs for the second time. He came in after midnight, when the streets were empty and most people were asleep, and he tied his horse behind the livery stable where it wouldn't be noticed. He wore dark clothes and his face was covered with a bandana except for his one good eye, and he carried 2 pistols and a knife, prepared for whatever resistance he might face. Herbert Wilkins lived in a nice house on the edge of town, a 2-story place with a white picket fence and rosebushes in the yard, the kind of house that announced its owner was respectable and successful, and Clayton approached it like a predator stalking prey. The back door was locked but not difficult to force, and Clayton slipped inside the dark house, moving silently through the kitchen and into the hallway. He found Herbert Wilkins asleep in his bedroom upstairs, snoring peacefully with his wife beside him, and Clayton felt a moment of something like pity for what he was about to do, but he pushed it aside because Herbert Wilkins had made his choice when he pulled that trigger in the bank. Clayton pressed his pistol against Wilkins' forehead and whispered, "Wake up, hero." Wilkins' eyes snapped open, and in the moonlight coming through the window, he saw the one-eyed man standing over him and knew instantly who it was. "Dalton," Wilkins gasped, "but you're dead, they said you were dead." Clayton smiled his twisted smile and said, "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Herbert, as you can see. Now get up, get dressed, and don't wake your wife unless you want her to become a widow tonight." Wilkins did as he was told, his hands shaking, his face pale with terror, and Clayton marched him out of the house at gunpoint, down the dark streets toward the bank. The town was silent, everyone sleeping, unaware that the ghost of Clayton Dalton had returned to finish what he started. At the bank, Clayton forced Wilkins to unlock the front door and then to open the vault, and when the heavy door swung open revealing stacks of cash and bags of coins, Clayton felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money. This wasn't about the money anymore, if it ever really had been. This was about proving a point, about showing that you couldn't kill Clayton Dalton and get away with it, about demonstrating that some men refuse to stay dead no matter what you do to them. He loaded money into a saddlebag he had brought, not being greedy, just taking enough to live comfortably for a year or two, and then he turned to Herbert Wilkins. "You know what you did wrong, Herbert?" Clayton asked conversationally, his pistol aimed at the banker's chest. "You fired that shot. If you had just let us rob the bank, take the money, and leave, none of this would have happened. Miguel would still be alive, the Kerrigan brothers would still be alive, Wade would still be alive, and I would still have both my eyes. But you had to be a hero, had to prove something, and look where it got us. You got men killed, you got me shot in the head, and now here we are again, except this time I'm the one holding all the cards." Wilkins was crying now, tears running down his face, and he stammered, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any of that to happen, I was just trying to protect the bank, I was scared." Clayton looked at him with his one good eye and said, "I know you were scared, Herbert, and I understand that. But understanding doesn't mean forgiving, and I'm not here to forgive you. I'm here to make sure you remember this night for the rest of your life, that every time you look in the mirror you'll think about Clayton Dalton and what you cost him." And with that, Clayton brought his pistol down hard on Wilkins' head, not hard enough to kill him but hard enough to knock him unconscious and leave a scar that would remind him of this night forever. Clayton left Wilkins lying on the floor of the bank, took his saddlebag full of money, and walked out into the night. He had considered killing Wilkins, had thought about it seriously, but in the end he decided that letting him live with the fear and the memory was a worse punishment than a quick death. He mounted his horse and rode out of Copper Springs heading west, and he was 5 miles away before anyone in town discovered what had happened, before they found Herbert Wilkins unconscious in his bank with a fortune in cash missing and the clear message that Clayton Dalton had returned from the dead to settle his score. The manhunt that followed was massive, probably the biggest manhunt in Arizona Territory history up to that point. The Pinkertons were embarrassed that a man they had claimed to kill was not only alive but had returned to complete his interrupted robbery, and they put every available agent on finding Clayton Dalton. Wanted posters went up across 3 territories offering a $1,000 reward, dead or alive, and every bounty hunter and lawman from California to Texas was looking for the one-eyed outlaw who had become a legend overnight. Newspapers wrote breathless accounts of the man who survived a bullet through the eye and came back for revenge, and Clayton Dalton became, in the span of a few weeks, one of the most famous outlaws in the West, his name spoken in the same breath as Jesse James and Billy the Kid. But Clayton had learned from his mistakes, had learned that fame was dangerous and that the key to survival was staying invisible. He disappeared into Mexico, crossed the border near Nogales, and vanished into the Sierra Madre Mountains where the law couldn't follow. He lived there for 3 years, in small villages where nobody asked questions and everybody minded their own business, and he used the money from the Copper Springs robbery to buy a small cantina in a town called San Miguel, a quiet place where he could live in relative peace. He never robbed another bank, never pulled another job, seemed content to fade into obscurity and let the legend of One-Eyed Dalton become just another story told in saloons and around campfires. But legends have a way of catching up with the men who create them, and in 1893, Clayton's past came looking for him one last time. James McAllister, the Pinkerton agent who had shot Clayton in Copper Springs, had never stopped looking for him, had made it his personal mission to finish what he started that day in the alley. McAllister tracked rumors and whispers, followed leads that took him deep into Mexico, and eventually he found San Miguel and the one-eyed gringo who ran the cantina there. On a hot afternoon in July 1893, James McAllister walked into Clayton's cantina, sat down at the bar, and ordered a whiskey. Clayton recognized him immediately, recognized the face of the man who had destroyed his eye and changed his life forever, and for a moment the two men just stared at each other across the bar, years of history hanging between them like smoke. Finally, McAllister said, "I've been looking for you for a long time, Dalton. Figured you'd be dead by now, bullet wound like that, but I should have known you were too stubborn to die properly." Clayton poured the whiskey, slid it across the bar, and said, "I could say the same about you, McAllister. Most men would have let it go by now, moved on with their lives, but here you are in the middle of nowhere looking to finish a fight that ended 4 years ago." McAllister sipped his whiskey and nodded. "That's the difference between us, Dalton. I finish what I start, and I started killing you in that alley in Copper Springs. The fact that you didn't have the decency to die doesn't change what needs to happen here." Clayton smiled his twisted smile and said, "You're welcome to try, McAllister, but I feel obligated to tell you that I'm a lot harder to kill than I used to be. That bullet you put through my eye taught me some valuable lessons about survival, and I don't plan on giving you a second chance to finish the job." The cantina had gone quiet, the handful of customers sensing that something serious was about to happen and moving quickly toward the exits. Clayton and McAllister sat there for another minute, finishing their drinks, and then, as if by mutual agreement, they both stood up and walked out into the street. The town of San Miguel didn't have a sheriff, didn't have any law to speak of, so nobody tried to stop what was about to happen. The two men walked to opposite ends of the dusty street, turned to face each other, and prepared for a showdown that had been 4 years in the making. Clayton Dalton had only one eye now, which should have put him at a disadvantage in a gunfight, should have affected his depth perception and his peripheral vision, but he had spent 3 years learning to compensate, learning to judge distances with one, learning to be faster than he had been before because he couldn't afford to miss. His hand hovered over his pistol, and he watched James McAllister with his one good eye, watched for the telltale signs that the Pinkerton agent was about to draw. The sun beat down on both men, sweat running down their faces, and somewhere a dog barked, and then McAllister went for his gun. They drew at almost the same instant, two trained fighters moving with practiced speed, and 2 shots rang out in the Mexican afternoon, echoing off the adobe buildings and sending birds scattering from rooftops. McAllister's bullet went exactly where he aimed it, right where Clayton's heart should have been, but Clayton had moved slightly to the left as he drew, an instinctive dodge that saved his life for the second time, and McAllister's bullet tore through his shirt and grazed his ribs but didn't hit anything vital. Clayton's bullet, on the other hand, was perfectly placed, catching McAllister in the center of his chest, punching through his heart and dropping him where he stood. James McAllister died in that dusty Mexican street, died trying to finish a job he had started 4 years earlier, and Clayton Dalton stood over his body feeling nothing, no satisfaction, no regret, just a weary sense that maybe, finally, his past was finished with him. He dragged McAllister's body to the edge of town, buried it in an unmarked grave because even outlaws deserved that much, and then he went back to his cantina and poured himself a drink. The few people who had witnessed the shooting said nothing, asked no questions, and life in San Miguel went back to normal as if nothing had happened. Clayton Dalton lived for another 32 years after that day, died in 1925 at the age of 64 from pneumonia, never having been arrested or killed despite being one of the most wanted outlaws of his era. He never returned to the United States, never left Mexico again, seemed content to live out his days as the one-eyed gringo who ran a cantina in San Miguel. When he died, he was buried in the town cemetery, and his headstone, paid for by the people of San Miguel who had come to respect him, read simply, Clayton Dalton, 1861 to 1925. He survived. And that, ultimately, is what Clayton Dalton's story is about, survival, pure and simple, the refusal to let circumstances or enemies or even a bullet through the eye dictate the terms of your existence. Most men who take a head wound like Clayton took would die within minutes, and the few who survived would be vegetables, brain damaged and unable to care for themselves. But Clayton survived with his mind intact, survived and thrived and lived another 35 years after the wound that should have killed him, and that survival is a testament to something that exists in all of us if we're willing to reach for it, the absolute refusal to quit, to give up, to let death win. Now I want you to think about something. Think about the last time you faced a challenge that seemed impossible, a situation where every rational voice in your head was telling you to quit, to walk away, to accept defeat. Maybe it was a business that was failing, a relationship that was broken, a dream that seemed too far out of reach. And ask yourself, did you push through it the way Clayton Dalton pushed through a bullet to the eye? Did you find that reserve of stubbornness and determination that exists somewhere deep inside all of us? Or did you take the easy way out, give up, tell yourself it was impossible? I'm not saying everyone needs to survive a gunshot wound to prove they're tough. I'm not saying we all need to become outlaws and seek revenge on our enemies. But I am saying that Clayton Dalton's story shows us what we're capable of when we absolutely refuse to accept defeat, when we look at what should be impossible and decide we're going to do it anyway. He survived a wound that should have killed him, crawled away from his own execution, spent 6 months recovering in a cave, and then rode back to finish what he started. That level of determination, that refusal to quit, is something all of us can aspire to even if our challenges don't involve bullets and bank robberies. So here's what I need you to do right now. If this story inspired you, if it made you think differently about what's possible when you refuse to quit, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we've got hundreds more stories of Wild West revenge and survival that will blow your mind and maybe, just maybe, inspire you to push a little harder when life knocks you down. And most importantly, drop a comment below and tell me, what's your bullet through the eye? What's the challenge you're facing right now that seems impossible? Share your story, because I guarantee someone else watching this video is facing something similar, and they need to know they're not alone. They need to know that if Clayton Dalton could survive what he survived, then maybe they can survive what they're going through. The Old West was brutal and unforgiving, it didn't give participation trophies or second chances, and it killed people every single day who weren't tough enough or smart enough or lucky enough to survive. But it also produced some of the most remarkable examples of human endurance and determination in history, people like Clayton Dalton who looked death in the face and told it to go to hell, people who redefined what was possible through sheer force of will. These stories matter, not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of what the human spirit is capable of when it's pushed to its absolute limit. Clayton Dalton's legend grew after his death, stories about the one-eyed outlaw spreading through Mexico and back across the border into the United States, each telling adding new details, new embellishments, until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. Some people said he had robbed 100 banks, killed 50 men, survived a dozen gunshot wounds. The truth, as documented in historical records and newspaper accounts and the testimony of people who knew him, was remarkable enough without exaggeration. He survived a bullet through the eye, recovered in a cave, returned to complete his interrupted robbery, and lived free for the rest of his life despite being one of the most wanted men in the West. But beyond the facts and the legend, Clayton Dalton's story teaches us something important about the nature of revenge and obsession. The old Clayton, the professional outlaw who robbed banks for money, would probably have cut his losses after Copper Springs, would have taken his survival as a sign to change careers and disappear. But the new Clayton, the one who woke up in that cave with half his face destroyed, was driven by something deeper than profit. He was driven by the need to prove that he couldn't be beaten, that the men who thought they had killed him were wrong, that Clayton Dalton set the terms of his own life and death and nobody else. That obsession could have gotten him killed, probably should have gotten him killed, but instead it drove him to accomplish something that seemed impossible and ensured his legend would live on long after he was gone. So as we wrap this up, I want you to remember Clayton Dalton not just as an outlaw or a survivor, but as an example of what happens when you combine toughness with absolute refusal to accept defeat. He wasn't superhuman, wasn't blessed with special powers or divine protection. He was just a man who got shot in the head and decided that wasn't going to be the end of his story, who crawled away from his own death, who healed himself through sheer determination, and who came back to finish what he started because anything less would have meant letting his enemies win. Hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and drop your story in the comments. Let's build a community of people who understand what it means to refuse to quit, who know that toughness isn't about how hard you can hit but about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. This is Wild West Revenge, and I'll see you in the next one. Now get out there and show the world that you're just as tough as One-Eye Dalton, because I promise you, you are. You just might not know it yet.